Well, hello everyone. And welcome to the Friends of San Pedro Valley Parks Life Sciences Series 2021. I'm Mila Stroganoff, Program Director and your webinar host. I would like to thank all of you for joining us today for Botany of Spring. Many thanks to all who contributed the informational flyer regarding, distributed the informational flyer regarding today's events. And it's a little after 4. We don't quite have everyone with us yet, but people will join as they can. Our website, friendsofsanpedrovalleypark.org, is a source for information regarding San Pedro Valley Park, its trails, flora and fauna. And we have an archive of newsletters as well. And these newsletters, this archive goes back all the way to 2007. So there's a lot of reading there if you're so interested. The Friends produce a bi-monthly newsletter, which you can receive when you become a member, and you can become a member online. That's a possibility right there. And then this lecture will be recorded by permission of the speaker and will be available on our website in approximately 2 weeks. And many thanks to my husband for all technical support and especially registration of attendees. These webinars take place due to his deep involvement. Many hours of contribution here. Not a small effort. With regards to upcoming programs, you can mark your calendars. On April the 17th at 4 p.m., we will bring you Akaruk Weiss, and she will discuss wolves in the western sector of the United States. And in our case, she will be discussing California and Oregon. Our upcoming March 27th program at 4 p.m. will bring Dr. Doug Bell, Wildlife Program Manager at East Bay Regional Parks District. And his lecture is entitled The Peregrine's Saga. We have, as you folks all know, we have a pair of peregrine falcons at Devil Slide, which is a hop, step, and skip from our region here in Lindomar and Pacifica. And hopefully there'll be a returning pair of peregrine falcons to Alcatraz Island. They were there and they had a couple of fledglings last spring. So hopefully there'll be a couple more fledglings this year. And here is the short abstract, which I will read. The talk will provide an overview of the peregrine falcon saga from the pre-DDT era through its drastic worldwide population crash to its present full recovery and beyond. We will touch on the cadre of researchers and citizen scientists who uncovered the DDT story, as well as the efforts to save the peregrine through captive breeding and reintroduction. In addition to illustrating the breeding chronology of peregrines, we will also discuss how its biology has allowed it to inhabit both the natural and the quote-unquote built environment. While the talk will focus on California, it will present a global perspective. Now, the questions with regards to this talk, please type into the Q&A section and then press enter. And we will answer as many questions as we can, time permitting. And any comments or anything, please place in the chat section. Again, on the same thing, type them in, press enter, and I'll get to them too, and we'll have a look. And now I have the distinct pleasure and honor of introducing our speaker, Dr. Nathalie Nagalingum. And she serves as the Associate Curator and McAllister Chair of Botany at the California Academy of Sciences. She oversees the institution's botany collection and regularly shares her research with the public. She investigates the evolution and diversification of plants, including ferns with a special focus on cycads. And cycads are cone-bearing, palm-like plants which comprise the most endangered group of organisms on Earth. Dr. Nathalie Nagalingum's research delves into the genetic diversity of cycads to guide conservation priorities, ensuring that the species most under threat in the wild are prioritized in the world's botanic gardens and in their natural habitats. Nathalie formerly worked at the Royal Botanic Garden in Sydney and received her PhD in paleobotany from the University of Melbourne. Her first research brings her across the globe, or field research, brings her across the globe from the outback of Australia to the rainforests of Malaysia. I think I have to go back to kindergarten and start reading. Anyway, a warm welcome to Nathalie, and please take it away.
Thank you, Mila. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for spending your sunny Saturday afternoon with me as well. So I wanted to, as Mila said, I primarily work on ferns and cycads. So I don't work on flowering plants, but when I do walk around nature and walk around botanic gardens in my neighbourhood, I do see flowers. And so I wanted to share what I see when I walk around in my everyday life, and hopefully give you a new appreciation of the beauty that you see around you and the nature that you see around you as well. And so I see, let me see. Oops, I'm trying to get my next slide. There we go. So I see in my neighbourhood, I go for a walk every day, and this is a couple of weeks ago, and of course I was thrilled when the first blossoms started appearing, and I'm sure many people are the same. It's the first sign that the weather is improving. And so of course I took a photo for the first blossoms. When I'm out in nature, I love to observe the flowers as well and look more closely. And so in the past week I was up at Fort Bragg in Mendocino County and saw these beautiful flowers. Of course I took a photo. I also went to the Mendocino Botanical Garden and observed the beautiful collection there. They had some magnolias and rhododendron in flower. Actually, I just took this yesterday. And so, I was observing the huge flowers and all the way to the tiny flowers as well. So these are little heath and erica flowers. And that was also at Mendocino. And then a couple of weeks ago, I went with my friends to the San Francisco Botanic Garden and saw all their beautiful magnolia collections. So if you're able to come over to San Francisco Botanic Garden, do come over and look at their magnolia collection. It's absolutely stunning. One of the plants that I loved seeing at the collection is the wattle. And so these are tiny little buds of the wattle flowers, and they originate from Australia. So I love going to the Australian garden within the botanical garden and seeing the Australian plants, and have a special love for the wattle flowers because they are the national flower of Australia. As you can tell from my accent, not from here. I moved here about 3 or 4 years ago, and the wattle is the national emblem of Australia. And this is the official coat of arms. You can see the kangaroo and the emu, and the wattle, the tiny little sprays of yellow flowers, those are the wattle flowers. And it grows in the southeast of Australia. This is called Acacia pycnantha. And it was officially made got the national flower in 1988. But the coat of arms, it dates from 1912. So it's had a long importance in Australia. And when we have the Olympics and when we have Australian sporting events, then the Australian team will wear red, gold and green, and that represents the wattle colours. So the green of the leaves and the yellow of the flowers. Over here in the US, my home now, the rose is actually the national flower of the US. And this actually happened in 1986, so pretty recently as well. And this occurred because of the tenacity of Louisiana Congresswoman Lindy Boggs. And she introduced a bill, and she rallied Congress, and she rallied the Senate to actually pass that bill. to make the rose the national flower of the US. And we have the rose garden as well. But prior to that, we had all of these different bills trying to introduce a national flower. So there was bills to introduce dogwoods, corn, mountain laurel, columbines, marigolds, all these things. But Congresswoman Lindy Boggs, she actually succeeded, and she got the rose as the national flower. And so today, flowers are really important to us. We use them as gifts, decorations. We have corsages, boutonnieres and bouquets that we send. We have them in weddings. And we've been using flowers for a very long time. In the Victorian times, they actually used flowers as kind of a way to send messages. And really, like during the Victorian times, they weren't very exuberant. You couldn't show affection or feelings outward. And so what they did was they used flowers to send messages. So for example, if you were trying to court somebody, you could send a bunch of flowers, maybe a red carnation that says, "My heart aches for you." But if you were not available, you would send a poppy and say, and that would mean, "I am not free." So you would break someone's heart with a flower. And you could also wear those different flowers on you to indicate your status as well. So, if you were available, you could wear something that indicated that you are available for courting, perhaps. And so the way that once you received some flowers, you had to figure out what it was. And so there were actually dictionaries to help figure out what your flowers meant. And there were multiple dictionaries that existed to help you figure out what the bouquet that you received meant. And some of these meanings derived from mythological roots of where people thought the flowers came from, or it could be from a characteristic of the flower. And so, for example, pansies, that means thinking of you. And the reason that pansies are called pansies is because in French, the word penser has been translated basically into pansy. And so penser means thinking. And so thinking of you derives from the original French word penser. And pansies got their name because the flowers look like they're kind of bobbed down, kind of like you're thinking about something. And so it was a characteristic of the flower that got it its name, its common name, pansy. But going way back before that, flowers had very different meanings and different uses. And one of the ways, many of the ways that flowers and plants were used was as medicine. And so people would look at, we didn't have science in the same way, or botany in the same way as we did back then. And so people would look at these flowers and plant structures and try and interpret why or how they could be used. And so they thought that God or the gods were sending them a message in how to use those flowers. And so if you look at the image on the left of the daisy, if you look at the far left, it kind of looks like an eye, from the side. And so that eye was thought to mean that sort of vision that it looks like an eye was thought to mean that these flowers could then be used for eye diseases or eye irritations. There are plants that look like a liver, and so they're called liverworts. We use that name today, and they were thought to cure liver issues. I found this image on the right of a flowering structure that looked like a unicorn. I really have no idea what that was supposed to be used for, but that was supposed to be some kind of signature as well. But really, flowers were not there to impart messages to us. Flowers are here to reproduce. to allow the plant to produce the next generation and produce many more plants. And so the flowers contain the reproductive organs. And flowers are characteristic of a particular group of plants that we call the Angiosperms. And the Angiosperms represent a characteristic of flowers, of course. And what's unique about the Angiosperms, and it's not found in any other plant group alive, is that they have the male parts and the female parts combined in a particular structure. So if you think of things like a conifer plant, like a conifer tree, the cones, the male parts and the female parts are in separate cones. They're not united. So that's what makes flowers so special, is that you have male and female united in one. If we go back in time, flowers are kind of the Johnny-come-latelys of the plant world. We've had plants for more than 300 million years, and flowering plants only arose in the last 135 million years. So that's the oldest record that we have of flowering plants. And that is actually a pollen grain. And so if you look at that figure, you can see C, which is a pollen grain. That's not the oldest one, but it's among the oldest one. And so pollen grains have a really waxy structure. And so that allows them to be preserved pretty readily. And so we first find a lot of pollen. And then we find leaves and flowers, which are more delicate. And so once we get a lot more flowers appearing, then that means that flowers have become more common. And what you're looking at in the image is a relative of a water lily. Those are among the earliest flowering plants. And the image in figure A is actually a charcoalified flower of a water lily that is over 100 million years old. And the pollen grain that we see in C is actually the pollen grain from that flower. So it's pretty remarkable that we can see these flowers that are that old. The image in D is actually a reconstruction of what that flower probably looks like. And it looks similar to what you see in the live water lily as well. And so once we got the first flowers, then insects and other pollinators evolved at the same time to really capitalize on this new source of food. And flowers then had this sort of co-evolutionary relationship, evolving new structures and new features to attract these pollinators. Then the pollinators became more specialized. So it's been an ongoing, dance between pollinators and seed dispersers and flowering plants. And for us, flowers are absolutely critical to even our existence. We use flowers to feed us, we use flowers to clothe us, we use flowers to shelter us. So our houses, when they're built of wood, many of them are from flowering plants. We have, so for example, oaks. We use various structures of flowering plants like the seeds, the fruits, the flowers, the stems, the roots. All of those come from flowering plants. Even things like gasoline and plastics that have come from oil, those are from ancient plants, or actually they're not flowering plants, but those are from ancient plants that preserved millions and millions of years ago. And so I wanted to go in and tell you what exactly are we looking at when we look at a flower. And so a flower consists of both male and female parts. And many of these pictures are images that I just took from around my neighbourhood. And so, if you take a closer look at the flowers around your neighbourhood, I'm sure you'll see all of these structures as well. And so the male parts in the flower, so I've zoomed in on that flower, what you have are the filament, and so it's that long structure, that long filament-like structure, and at the very top of that is the anther, and so that's what has the pollen on it. So that's what we call the male, because the pollen then produces the sperm. The other part of the flower, which is in the centre, are the female parts, and those consist of what we call 3 parts, which is the stigma, the style, and ovary, and we call that collectively the pistil. You don't need to know all these words, but I just wanted to tell you the words so you know what you're looking at. And so we have the stigma, which is typically sticky. So you can kind of remember it as sticky stigmas. And so that's at the very top, and that's where the pollen lands. And so it's sticky because because the pollen will stick to it. Then the pollen will germinate and a pollen tube will grow all the way down the style. And then it will go down to the ovary, and then it will release the sperm next to the eggs. And then you get fertilization and a seed. So if we what I did was then cut this flower in half. And then you can see those female structures again. And it's a little bit clearer here, where you have the stigma at the top, and then you have the style that goes all the way down, and the ovary at the base. And then that is where the eggs are. And then that's where the seed will be produced. The other structures in the flower are going to be the petals, which we all know about, and they're different colours and different arrangements. And then the other structure is going to be the sepal. And that's typically green, but it can be a different colour as well. And so when we add all of those up together, we have a flower. And so it's pretty much the base plan for almost all flowers, those structures. And of course, it's nature, so there's going to be variations on that base plan. So we have what we call a perfect flower that has all of the male parts and all of the female parts. So in this perfect flower, you can see the anthers in purple, and that star-shaped stigma. And so that's the female part. So we have male and female, meaning this is a perfect flower. And botanists love to have terms for everything. We have imperfect flowers. And so that means it doesn't have all of the parts. So for example, squash, the flowers are imperfect because you'll have male flowers. So the one on the left, which will have the anthers on there, but it doesn't have a stigma. And then the corresponding flower, which is the female flower, that has the stigma. And you can see the stigma is divided into 3 parts at the very top. And so we have the male and female are separate flowers, and so they're called imperfect. We have petals that are what we consider free, so they're not united at their base. On the other hand, we have petals that can be fused to form a tube, and they can be fused for the whole length of the flower. In this Bruxmania, I think the common name is like angel trumpet. And so this one's fused for the entire length. You can have partially fused. You can have solitary flowers, so flowers that are just by themselves. We don't have other flowers like with it on that stem. And again, here's another example of a solitary flower. And the way that you can distinguish solitary flowers is that there are actually leaves in between the flowers. So you can see clearly on this one, this mallow, is that you have leaves that sort of separate these different flowers. And so this is what we call a solitary flower. The opposite of that is an inflorescence. And so we have the structure, the central column, and surrounding those are many, many flowers. And so this is one example of an aloe that has lots of flowers. You can't see any leaves separating those flowers, and so that means it's an inflorescence. This is a photo of my friend Lyra and I. We saw this huge agave flower in the Mission a while ago. And so here we are with this huge inflorescence. And so an inflorescence can be really small or it can be enormous like this one. And so we have a huge diversity of flowers across the flowering plant tree of life. And so as scientists, what we try and do is actually make sense of all of this diversity. And one way that we do that is to create a family tree of the flowering plants. I am involved in different work, looking at, for example, the fern family tree and the cycad family tree. But as scientists, other scientists, colleagues of mine, look at the flowering plant family tree. And what we use, in the past we used the appearance of the flowers to construct the tree, to figure out what was most similar. Now we use DNA characters to figure out what is most similar. So in the same way we use things like Ancestry.com or 23andMe to figure out your ancestry, we do the same with our DNA, with the DNA of flowering plants. And so in this, every single little, you can see there's tiny little text in the middle of the slide, that represents a different species. There are thousands of species of flowering plants, and these are not all represented in there, but the major groups are represented as species. And so each different species is linked to another species, and you can see those little branches that join up to each other. And what we as scientists have been doing is figuring out what the relationships are at a very broad level like this, and then at really sort of small levels like how individual species in the same group are related to each other. And then we use this tree to figure out how to name things like species and genera, families and orders. This tree has these really broad groups that are named and coloured. You can see these sort of, I'm not sure how much you can see on your views, but you can see these different colours of the groups of branches indicating the major groups of flowering plants. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of these groups. I'm going to talk about the light green one called the Monocots, and I'll also be talking about the Asterids, which is in the lilac on the bottom right. And what you can see is that these groups have a lot of diversity. The flowers can look very different to each other, but they do have some features that unite them. And I'm going to talk about those kind of features to give you an idea of what they look like. And so the first group that I want to talk about are the Monocots. There's huge diversity of Monocots and many, many species of Monocots. You probably may have eaten some Monocots for breakfast. So things like wheat is a Monocot. We have grass, rice, ginger, iris, all of these different plants that we use are called Monocots. And the term monocot is when we look at the seed and there's only one cotyledon. So if you germinate a monocot seed, you'll only find one leaf that emerges first. When you germinate non-monocots, you'll find two leaves that emerge first. What we call those leaves cotyledons. And so monocots is a single leaf when the seed germinates. And so all of these plants and different families of monocot will all do that. The way that you can tell monocot flowers that they have parts in three. And this one's pretty obvious. You can see three what we call Tepples here. And then the stigma also is in threes, and the anthers are also in threes as well. And this is a lily that I took a photo of outside of Sydney a couple of years ago. The other distinctive feature of monocots is that they have what we call Tepples. And so I talked about sepals and petals before. We don't see any sepals in monocots. You can't see any of those green structures at the base. And so that means those are called Tepples. And tulips, for example, they have Tepples. There are Tepples in other plant groups as well, but definitely if you have groups of three and Tepples, then you've most likely got a monocot. So tulips are one. Daffodils are also another monocot as well. And again, it has parts in three. And this one you kind of have to, I mean, if you look, you can count 6 Tepples. So that's pretty obvious. And even within that, you can see the parts of 3. And so you have this is like 2 o'clock. So this is the first whirl, 2, 6 and 10 o'clock. Those are the first whirl of Tepples. And then if you look at the next whirl, you'll see at 12, 4, and I think that's 7 or 8, then that's the second whirl of Tepples. So you have 2 whirls of Tepples and in total 6 Tepples. The inner structure is what we call a corona, because the corona means crown, and that's how the coronavirus got its name, because it looks like it has a crown on it. But we use that word elsewhere in biology as well. And in this case, the corona is the central area where the Tepples have been fused to each other. And so it forms a crown-like structure. Another very diverse family within the monocots are the orchids, and they have really crazily modified structures. And so I'm going to sort of go through what they actually are, and this certainly doesn't cover all orchids, but will help you look at the orchids, you know, that you are growing, and hopefully sort of you're able to make them grow. I am terrible at growing plants, especially orchids. And so orchids, again, they have tepals. There's sort of different words that are used for orchids, but we can call them tepals. Then there are some of the tepals are highly modified, and so one of the tepals is modified into a structure that we call the lip, and it surrounds some other structures where the female and male parts are. And so there's a column, and the column bears the stigma, but the stigma is actually, and remember the stigma is where the pollen lands, so the sticky stigma. And so the stigma is actually hidden behind this anther, which is kind of weird. And so the anther has what we call pollinia. This means the pollen is actually bundled up into this structure called pollinia. And so when an insect will fly into the flower, so it sort of lands and it's guided to the column by the lip, and then it will get the pollinia actually rubbed on its back or on its head, and it dislodges the anther and the pollinia, and then it reveals the stigma. So it's really kind of a very, very specialized flower. The other group, and this is probably my favorite group to talk about, are the daisies. And I've called them flowers, and as you'll see, they're not actually flowers in the daisy family. And this is one of the things when I was an undergrad and learning about botany that just totally blew my mind. And it made me see these flowers in a totally different way. And when we look at daisies, there's again a lot of diversity in there. We use daisies, we use sunflowers, sunflower oil, we eat daisies in lettuce, and there's thistle as well, so it's decorative. And of course, you know, we have daisies that we grow in our gardens and use in floral decorations. But the thing about daisies is that when we look at what we consider a flower, it's actually what we call an inflorescence. So if you remember a few slides ago, we talked about inflorescence, meaning a cluster of flowers all together on the same structure. So they're not separated by leaves. So what you're looking at here is not actually one flower, but probably tens of flowers. And so I'm zooming in here, and what you see at the center, and so now you can probably see a little bit more clearly, is that each of these little structures in the center is an individual flower, and that's what we call a floret. We call a floret. And you can see the ones that kind of have a ring around them, those individual ones, those are the petals. And so what are you looking at when you see those red bits? Those are actually flowers as well, and I'm showing you that in this way with a yarrow flower. So again, a similar structure where you have the central flowers or florets, and then the outer florets. And we as botanists, of course, have special names for them. So we have what we call disc florets. So those are the ones in the center, and then ray florets are the ones on the outside. And so the disc florets are symmetrical, and you can see in the drawing, there's a drawing on the right, there's two florets. So the one on the left, that is what we call a disc floret, and you can see the petals, and you can see the stigma. And the anthers. And those are the central florets, and then the one on the right, it's an asymmetric floret, and that's the ray floret. And so that's what we kind of think of when we look at a daisy flower and think that they're petals. So in fact, what we're looking at are several petals that are fused. And the way that you can tell that there are petals that are fused is that if you look at the very tip of each of those petals, which is actually multiple petals, is that you can see individual notches in there. And so that tells us that there's actually 3 petals that are fused to each other. And so again, you have this asymmetry that each particular ray floret on the outside ends up looking like a petal. And just to get a different view of that, if you have, for example, a sunflower, you have both the ray and the disc florets. And so the image on the bottom gives you an idea of the ray florets. So those are the little tiny ones, and they're symmetrical. The one on, and then the far left is the far right within that one is the ray floret. So that one looks like a really big petal. On the other hand, you can also have flowers that are ray florets only. So the ones with the big petals. And so, for example, a dahlia like this one has only ray florets. And then you can have a disc floret flower only, and so that's going to look like basically like a little ball at the center of a sunflower without any ray florets. And again, so this is a sunflower that I saw a while ago in the Richmond, and of course I had to take a photo of it. But you can see here that they have a particular arrangement of the disc florets, and if I zoom in, what you can see is all of those florets really, really clearly. And so it's once you start looking at these daisy flowers, it's like a whole world is going to get opened up to you, and you'll see them in a very, very different way. And one of the things you can do is just pull them apart and separate them into the individual flowers, which I love to do. So you can just, you can be your own explorer and discover what the florets are within these different daisies. I also wanted to talk about another sort of variation that we see with flowers, which are flowers with bracts. And bracts are another botanical term that we use for coloured leaves. And it's really easy to get confused because you see them, that they're brightly coloured, and you think that they're petals. But in fact, once you look a little bit more closely, you'll see that these very common plants like dogwood and the poinsettias actually have the flowers at the very centre, and what you're looking at on the outside, which you think is a petal, is actually a bract. So it's a leaf that is not green anymore, but it's actually a different colour, so white or red. And for example, this bougainvillea, this again was a photo I took in my neighbourhood. If you look closely, what you think are petals, so the purple, are actually bracts, because you look at it closely and you can see these white flowers, which is it's pretty clear. You can see that it's a flower unto itself. And so what's happened is you've got an inflorescence of these 3 flowers, and the purple bracts are on the outside. Bracts occur in multiple places on the Angiosperm tree of life, and so it's not distinctive of any different family. And so you saw the previous ones, the dogwood, here's the bougainvillea, and then in the arum and the philodendron family, we also have these bracts, but they're actually given special names. And so we have the spade, which is the term that we use in this family to describe the bracts, and we have the spadix. And so the spade is the white bract, and so what you think of as a petal, again, is a trick, and it's actually the bract. It's that we call the spadix. Inside that, the central column, the white bract is called the spade, and then the central column is called the spadix. Sorry about that. And so the spadix is, when we look at it, and I found this great picture online that shows you that the spadix is actually an inflorescence. In this case, it's a really small inflorescence, but you can see at the base of that are the stigmas. So they're all sticking out, and those are the female structures. So you've got all of those together, again, no leaves in between. So that means it's an inflorescence. And then the top part is what will produce pollen. And so you're going to have the male and the female flowers on this one structure, so the inflorescence. If we look at a peace lily, Again, you have the spade and the spadix. So the spade is the white part. And then if you look, you zoom in, you can see the flowers, which is the spadix. And in this case, you've got these little anthers that are sticking out. It's kind of hard to tell, but there's actually some anthers towards the sort of more basal flowers, and they're kind of like just popping their heads out. Again, another variation is the arum lily, and instead of a white spade, you've got a pink and white spade. And again, that column-like structure is the spadix, so that's where the flowers are. One of the most special spade and spadixes that we see in flowering plants is the Titan arum. And we all love Titan arum. They're pretty amazing. They are the largest inflorescence on Earth. And this is a picture I took from the Conservatory of Flowers. I think it was 2017 when this one flowered. And so this man, I somehow took this really great photo of this man with his son, showing how big the inflorescence is. And in this case, the spade is kind of burgundy coloured and it hasn't yet opened, so bloomed. And the spadix is that central column. And so all of these flowers, you know, why do they look the way they do? And it's because of pollination. So just to sort of go quickly back to what we looked at before, we have the various structures. We have the anther and the filament. So the anther is what produces pollen. And we have the stigma, the style, and the ovary. And the ovary is where the eggs are. And you can see the little balls there, which is where the eggs are. And the goal of the flower is to enable reproduction. But we need some way for the pollen to get onto the stigma. And flowers have a variety of ways of transferring the pollen onto the stigma. And it involves all the structures of the flowers, including the petal as well, and the sepals too. And so flowers look the way they do because they want the pollinators to come and find them. And so they've developed a series of, mechanisms to get these pollinators to pollinate them. And so it could be through colour, sort of visual display. It could be through, skip through all this slide. It could be through rewards such as nectar. And so flowers are adapted very specifically in some cases to their pollinators. And in this case, this is Darwin's hawk moth. And the flower on this is actually an orchid that is found in Madagascar. And what you can see is that there is this huge structure within the flower, and that is where the nectar is. And so this means, this is highly specialised just for this particular moth, with this huge, what you can see, that's its tongue. And so that tongue can go all the way down to get the nectar. That is like super, super specialised. And so really when, thinking back to like the doctrine of signatures and how people thought that, these flowers were telling the messages, flowers were not telling us messages, they were giving messages to their pollinators such as this. And so thinking of all the different pollinators that we have, bees, for example, the flowers are particularly adapted to whatever pollinator it is. And so the bees, they have this cute little body that can fit within these tubular structures. And so oftentimes you'll have a tubular structure for a bee pollinated flower, and it will provide nectar as a reward. So that will make the bee attracted to the flower and come and pollinate it, get pollen on it and bring it to the next flower. Pollen also is a reward as well. It's got proteins, it's got vitamins, it's got minerals. So in addition to nectar, the bees also use the pollen. We'll also see when you have bee pollinated flowers that they're going to be open during the day. bee pollinated flowers can also be kind of open like this and have a landing pad so that the bees can have somewhere to land when they gather the pollen and the nectar. And the particular the appearance of the petals, the way the colours are and the sort of the markings is also a guide for the bees to tell them where you can find the nectar. And different pollinators have different vision. And so bees can see UV light, unlike us. And so once you look at flowers under UV light, you're getting a bee's eye view of what the flower looks like. And so this just, the bottom images show you what these flowers look like to a bee. And it's pretty clear the flowers are signaling to the bee, come here for the nectar. And so they can see blues and yellows or a mixture of that, but they cannot see red. And so if you're going to have a bee pollinated flower, it's either going to be blue or yellow or a mixture of those. Anything that's red will not be pollinated by a bee. And then when you look at the flower under UV light, here is, I love this particular picture, it's almost like it's glowing, saying, here is the pollen, here is the nectar, come get it, bee. These are very important pollinators. They are required for almonds, and here's an almond orchard, and almonds will not get pollinated unless bees are there. And so there are specialists who will bring their bees and they will go to the orchids and bring their bees there for the almonds to get pollinated. And so things like, you know, the decline of bees are a major problem for our crops, especially almonds, but many other crops like apples and cranberries and melons, blueberries, cherries, all require bee pollination. And so bees provide a really important role for not only flowers, but also for us in feeding us too. Another pollinator that you're all familiar with are butterflies. And their rewards or attractants are things like scent. The nectar is typically hidden. And so, you know, the butterflies with their long proboscis, they're able to access hidden nectar, unlike other pollinators. They also have a specialised structure like a landing pad for them. And so this sort of shows you what the landing pad would look like for butterflies. When you have a butterfly pollinated flower or inflorescence in this case, they're going to be reds and yellows, oranges and purples because butterflies see different colours. On the other hand, we can also have flies as pollinators. Not as common as bees and butterflies, but we definitely can have fly pollinated flowers. And in this case, we have the spade and the spadix. And here it's actually purple or burgundy really. And that's really because flies are attracted to flesh. And so the flower and the bract has been modified so that the fly will be attracted to them. And so what we can see is that another example of a flower that is pollinated by flies is the Rafflesia. I forgot to mention in the previous slide that flies are also attracted by a rotting smell. And so they're typically associated, that rotting smell is associated with fly pollinated flowers. Rafflesia is another flower that all botanists go crazy about. It's the largest flower in the world. It occurs in Asia, typically, like this is a photo taken in Malaysia. I don't know who this person is. I just found this picture online, but I love how this lady was super excited. But this is actually one flower. And so this is the largest flower in the world. You can see it's kind of like flesh colored, and it also has an aroma of rotting meat as well. Perfect for flies. And the Titan arum that I showed you before, the Conservatory of Flowers, that also has a particular smell and colour. And so this is me with my two friends, Lauren and Lyra. And this is last summer when the Conservatory of Flowers plant bloomed again. And instead of being able, because of Corona, we were not able to go into the conservatory. And so what we did was we were able to observe the inflorescence from behind some perspex. But even from behind the perspex, we could smell that rotting aroma. To me, it smelled a little bit like rotting garbage, actually. But again, you can see that it has that sort of burgundy colour. And again, that is to attract the flies. And then birds are typical pollinators for many flowers as well. And here I am with my friend Rebecca, she's in the background, and her daughter Skylar, and hello Skylar if you're watching. Birds, and here I am explaining to Skylar that my finger's a bird and it's going to go into the flower and get nectar. And so if you look at those individual flowers, those structures are perfectly shaped for a beak for a bird. And again, like the butterflies, they have buried nectar because the beaks and their tongues can go and source those, and they're going to be open in the daytime as well. Another feature of flowers that are pollinated by birds is that they're kind of rigid. And if you look at this, this flower being pollinated by a bird in South Africa, this bird is grabbing onto the structure, onto the stem. And so oftentimes these inflorescences are going to be quite rigid to be able to withstand the bird sort of rustling around in there. The other feature of flowers that are pollinated by birds is that they're kind of going to be hanging down, and so this also allows the bird to access it as well. So you can see these flowers are hanging downwards, as opposed to the other ones that have more like landing pads. And again, the way that the flower is structured is sort of the shape of it is ideal for these particular bird pollinators. And you can see this one, when the hummingbird goes into the flower, its beak is perfectly positioned to get the nectar with its tongue, and the anthers actually go onto the top of the head of the hummingbird and deposits the pollen on it. And so it's pretty incredible how this flower is perfectly adapted to having this pollinator, this hummingbird. And then the next time it goes to another flower, then it's going to brush the pollen up against the stigma and pollinate the stigma. And the key feature for birds, bird pollinated flowers, are that they are red. And if you remember, bee pollinated flowers are not red, they're blue and they're yellow. And so whenever you see a red one that's kind of shaped like this, then it's going to be a bird. One of the other last pollinators I talk about, there are some other pollinators such as beetles and mammals, but I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to talk about bats, which also are a kind of mammal, because I think they're really interesting and kind of rare pollinators. But they are attracted by fruity or musky smells. The flowers are white. So if you think that they're going to be open at night, because bats are flying at night, so it's better for a flower to be white for a bat to see it at night. It's going to produce nectar, that's going to be produced at night, and the flowers will open at night as well. And so there are flowers that open during the day, and those are things like bird and bee pollinated. Bat pollinated flowers are going to be open only at night. And they actually produce a lot of nectar for these, for the bats as rewards. There are lots of plants that are pollinated by bats, so things like mangoes, bananas, guavas, and coolly agave, which is where we get our tequila, those are all bat pollinated. And then of course there are flowers that are not pollinated by an external animal source. They're flowers that are pollinated by the wind. And so one classic example of this are actually corn flowers. And so they're either they're adapted to being pollinated by the wind, and so produce copious amounts of pollen. They don't need to produce petals, and so you won't see any petals on them. And they don't need to produce any rewards like nectar because they don't need to attract a pollinator. And so with this corn, what you can see, I've got the arrows here, are the female flowers, and you can see at the top are the male flowers. And when you look more closely at a corn, like a pre-cob of corn, you can see that there are male flowers, so those are at the top. And you can see that on the right is the blown up image of that, and that's the anthers. And so that's what produces the pollen, and that just gets exposed into the wind. And because it's not a very directed way of pollination, you get many, many, many pollen grains being produced. The female part, which is what we call the tassel in corn, is actually the stigmas. And so those are also exposed to the wind in the chance that the pollen is going to blow onto them as well. So next time you're eating a corn, think of the male parts and the female parts. And so the tassel is going to be the female parts. And then when we have pollination, sometimes plants often can self-pollinate, but really they want to produce a diverse sort of genetic makeup for the next generation and have variation. And so they have a whole bunch of features that prevent self-pollination. And I'm not going to go into all the nitty-gritty about that, but we can have things like differences in timing. And so the anthers will produce the pollen at a different time compared to the stigma. And so you can see on the left, the anthers are producing the pollen, but the stigmas aren't receptive right now. On the right, you can see the stigmas have opened and the anthers have pretty much released all of their pollen. And so that's the way we get differences in timing to prevent self-pollination. Physically, you can have the parts of the flower separate, so the male parts and the female parts, and so they're not going to come into contact with each other and have pollinate each other. And then plants also have a very complex chemical system that recognizes self, and so then it will stop things like the pollen tube growing to fertilize, and so it will then stop fertilization from happening. So a whole bunch of things that the plants have figured out what to do to prevent what we call selfing. And so with that, I want to encourage you all to look at the nature around you, and hopefully this has given you a way of appreciating the beauty around you. I remember when I was learning about this in undergrad and thinking, I hope this doesn't remove the beauty of flowers and plants for me. But actually what it did was it gave me really a new appreciation of it. And so it felt like a deeper appreciation of the world around me. And so, I can go for a walk and not just appreciate the beauty, but actually take a much closer look and look at the ingenious way that evolution has figured out how to reproduce and produce the next generation. So with that, I just want to encourage you all to explore your gardens, your nearby parks, your neighbourhood, anything around you to see the joy and the beauty of spring. So with that, I will take questions. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Nathalie. All right, so let's see, let's check what's happening in let's check what's happening. Well, actually, with regards to magnolias, which are considered primitive flowers, what is it that they're missing, so to speak? Which parts are they missing? I know that the center section is like a cone.
Yeah, so when I was taught undergrad, I was taught that that magnolias were primitive, but in fact they're not primitive. If you saw those water lilies, those are some of the earliest flowers, and so we when we first were looking at the fossil record, we saw these big sort of magnolia-like flowers and thought, oh, these are the earliest flowers. But then once we started looking more closely and looking at, these microscopic flowers and, sifting through the dirt and sifting through fossil sort of matrices, we found that there were other flowers that were actually more ancient. And so they're not actually particularly primitive. They are kind of old, but not the oldest flowers. Their structures are really weird. And so because they do have that central column. And so what we have sort of at the top of them is the female parts. And we actually have multiple what we call pistils. So the stigma, style and ovary, they're fused together. Actually, did I have a photo? No, I thought I did have a photo. So all the pistil, so all the female parts are all fused together, and we have multiple female parts fused together to form the top part of the column. Mm-hmm. And then we have the male parts, the stamens, at the base of the column. And so once you get pollination, you know how you see that kind of cone and then the seeds sort of emerging out of those cones? That's individual ovaries that are producing the seeds.
Okay. All right. Let's check and see. Thank you. All right. Because almonds, Barbara Daly is asking, because almonds have to be pollinated by bees, is that also true of other kinds of nuts?
Different nuts are not necessarily in the same family. This is the rose family, but I not necessarily, no. I don't know the ins and outs of all of the nuts, but definitely things like cherries, where you have to have pollination. And so if you have a cherry tree and it hasn't been producing cherries, that's because you haven't got a male plant or a female plant nearby, and you haven't had bees come to pollinate them. So cherries are in the same family as almonds.
Okay. And they also need a lot of water. Yes.
That I don't know about.
Do wind-pollinated plants, this is William Hudson, he's wondering about wind-pollinated plants and whether they have aerodynamic features because they have to travel.
Yes, so the pollen has aerodynamic features. And the one I can think of at the top of my head is Conifer Pollen. And so it has the pollen like a little ball, and it's got these kind of like Mickey Mouse ears that allow it to sort of fly into the air. And then the seeds, if they're wind pollinated, they also are different as well. But the pollen is going to be really small and really light so that it actually travels on the wind. So for example, grass pollen is really simple, really smooth, really small, and so it gets to travel in the wind really easily.
So it just gets carried up with the currents.
Yes. So if you compare it to other plants that are not pollinated by wind, that have insect pollination, the pollen grains are much bigger and heavier as well.
Okay. So let me just check if there's any questions. Aha. Okay, let me just check because we got some questions in chat too, I think. And it says that there are lots of wattles on San Bruno Mountain, just in case you get lonesome for
one. Oh, okay. I'll have to check that out.
Okay. And, okay, so let's see. Okay, and everyone is saying, okay. Oh, yes, and then there's something about Carol Young, from Carol Young, asking, are papaya trees male and female? And if so, how do the female trees get pollinated to produce fruit?
I have no idea. I don't know if they're male or female. And I'm trying to think of papaya. I don't know what papaya flowers look like, so I don't know. I'm sorry, I can't answer that one.
And she also says she's learned a lot about her plants in her garden and how they get pollinated. So
right.
that's very helpful. Yes. Always a major mystery. Yeah. Okay, so let's see. What is the and what would Irene Lee is asking, and what is the advantage for a plant to have a separate male and female flower on separate plants, for instance, when they're not monoecious and they're dioecious? What is the advantage of that?
So there's definitely, the plant will not self-pollinate. And so you're definitely going to get genetic diversity. And so it means, if you have a whole bunch of plants that are clones, then it's not genetically diverse. And so if you have something like a particular fungus that comes through, you might not have the variation that allows some variant that allows the plant to fight it if everything's the same. So you want as much genetic diversity as possible. And so by ensuring that you have a male plant and a female plant, they have to cross-pollinate. And so it's kind of the extreme, I showed there's two physically sort of different flowers at the very end, where you have the male parts becoming receptive, different to the female part. And so this is kind of an extreme form of making sure that they don't self-pollinate.
So it's obviously something that evolution takes as an extreme case rather than being the rule of the rule of thumb.
There's not many examples. Flowering plants evolve. The key feature of flowering plants is that the male and the female are in the same structure.
Right.
And so if we think back to the very first flower, it's going to be male and female in the same. But some of these flowering plants have figured out this new way had figured out this different way to do it. It's a system that is that it works because it's arisen in several different groups within the flowering plant tree of life. So it's not like this one crazy thing that kind of worked in one. It's been repeated. So evolution has come upon this particular way of reproduction in multiple different groups, so multiple times in the history of flowering plants.
Okay, so let me check. And we have Yafi is asking, what kind of flowers can attract bees the most? It's all based on color, yeah? It's
based on a whole bunch of different things, and it may be, different bee species, and I'm not an entomologist, but maybe different bee species attracted by different particular features. So, we have a whole suite of features. So, you have the UV, you have the nectar, you have the color, so of the pollen as well. So it's going to be specialized to a particular bee. And so it's hard to say which is going to have, the best result.
Just plant a whole bunch of different plants, flowers, and see what will come to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So that's why we have diversity. Whatever works the best.
Yeah. Okay. So what is this? It says amazing presentation. Learned so much. Now I totally understand why all the bees in my garden love the borage, rosemary bushes, and sunflowers so much. The borage. Yes, so this is from Angelica Harmon to all. Okay, let me check what's happening in Q&A. Let's see. Okay, so William Hudson is asking, all the roses are the national flower. Aren't they non-native to the US?
Yes, definitely. So roses are also the national flower for England. So, like English rose, I think, and the Maldives as well. So definitely not native. As a botanist, I would probably choose something native, but a rose has been chosen, and I think it's because of its beauty. But I would choose something native. Like the California poppy. That's our native, our flower for California, and that's native to California. So I would definitely choose something that's native. I guess the problem is, if you do choose a flower, you might get other states mad at you. So say we said the national flower would be the poppy. Other states would be mad because it occurs in California. And so I think that would be really tough.
Yes, every state has its flower and it has its reptile and it has its, you know, you just name it. And there's all these different categories for each and every state in the US. And then, of course, if you're going to choose one flower, yes, it gets a little rough, doesn't it?
Yeah, yes. So yeah, but yeah, I would choose another one, but we've got the rose. So
we've got the rose. As long as you can pass it through the federal government and get the stamp of approval.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, and that's why there were all these other flowers that went through, but were proposed but never went through, and you know, because it was so difficult to pass through.
Okay, so let's see what else is here. Yes, like they're saying the Rosa californica. Don is saying Rosa californica is a California native.
That's true. Yes.
It's yes. I don't think I'm missing anyone here. Let's see. And then a lot of the dispersal also occurs with animals. I mean, they help so much, whether it's rodents, whether it's attaching themselves to hoofs or whatever, the major dispersal of seed takes place.
Yes, and that's another, like, I could talk for another hour about seed. And again, it could be wind pollinated as well. And so there's adaptations, not wind pollinated, wind dispersed as well. Some are by water. So for example, big coconut seeds are water dispersed. And so that has particular adaptations. So it's all, that's another talk in itself.
And for instance, there are certain plants that are circumpolar. And literally they, I mean, wind, right? I mean, what other possibility could, it's not as if people are going to move this plant from one area to the next around the North Pole, so to speak, and plant it. So it has to be a wind.
Well, there's also birds as well, because birds can eat the seeds and then poop them all around. So if these birds have, travel really long distances, then they can poop them, all around the northern hemisphere or wherever they go. So that's another way you can get really big distributions of plants too.
And the restriction, if certain plants like the Manzanita uva ursi, for instance, is circumpolar, it's basically because of climate. It's because of certain conditions of the plant that make it comfortable within those northern, very cooler regions?
It's all of the above, or some of the above. Like we have to reconstruct that history. Sometimes, there was an extensive climate. I could come up with a whole range of sciences for you, right, to explain one particular distribution. That's what we do as scientists, is trying to figure out why these things happen.
Right, because some of the birds fly from north to south and south to back up to the north, and so distribution of plants can occur that way as well, which they do.
Yeah, and also
in North America, South America, you have them in Europe, you have them in Africa.
That's right. Yes, and also past climate as well.
Yes.
Sometimes these plants are really distributed really widely. And now they're just a relic of where they were. And so, maybe that's, there was a really great climate and they just were able to spread everywhere. And now they're just restricted to a smaller place, but where the climate is more suitable for them. Hard to say.
Right. Well, as you say, there are many factors that are involved in where the plants reside and where they started and where they end up, basically.
Yes.
And the pockets they're left in now due to various circumstances.
Yes.
Okay, well, something else has popped up. Okay, let's see. Is there any significance? Helen is asking, is there any significance to the different colors of pollen? And does pollen actually come in different colors?
Oh, they're kind of a little bit different. I can get sort of more yellow and brown. I don't know.
Mm.
I don't think it's a particular attractant to insects, but I'm not sure. I don't know the significance of that. That's a good question.
And William is asking, potatoes are a major food crop. Do you know how they are pollinated?
Potatoes are in Solanaceae, the potato family, and those flowers are kind of tubular, they're kind of purple. So I'm guessing bees, but I'm not sure. Yeah, so things like eggplants are also Solanaceae, tomatoes, so they're bees mostly.
And this is a big question. There's all sorts of things popping up. So William is asking, on which continent did flowering plants originate? For instance, there was Pangaea, and in the process of breaking up, how did they get to the secondary continents, and which plants, and so on and so forth. So big question.
That is a really good question. And so we have the earliest examples of flowering plants are Israel and Australia. These are pollen grains that are 135 million years old. They were, in such separate areas. We don't know how they spread around the world. And pretty much after appearing in the fossil record, there's a huge diversity that appears straight away, like many, many species, compared to, other groups that kind of evolve very slowly to become very diverse. And this was such an important and puzzling question that Darwin called it an abominable mystery. And it's something he thought about a lot. He wrote about it. And as botanists, we are still considering that abominable mystery question. Like, how did flowers become so diverse? How did they travel the world so quickly? We don't know. We're still arguing about it. We're still trying to figure that out.
I always have a problem of thinking about, well, you've got a flower and then you've got these insects. And so how do they communicate to each other the various parts that they want? And how do they adjust without, there must be some communication system going on between plants and animals and insects and birds, because somehow or other things evolved, and the other, the plants evolved, the flowers evolved, and you've got these birds and bees and insects and all the rest of it, and somehow they're co-evolving, but they're not talking to each other. Yes, they are. They must be.
Yeah, so they're talking in different ways. So they're talking in terms of the nectar. They're talking in terms of the colour of the petals. They're talking in terms of the structure of the flower, like having an ideal structure to land on that is suited to that particular pollinator. And so if you think over millions of years, one plant maybe produced a little bit more nectar. And so that's going to attract more birds to that plant, and it reproduces more. And so that gets passed on to the next generation. And so that's how you get this co-evolution occurring, because we have this sort of fine tuning that occurs with each generation to produce this sort of really specialized relationship. Mm-hmm. So they talk not with words, but in very different ways that we don't use.
And as you say, the variation in population, those that are successful in reproduction are the ones that carry on the genes and provide more of a population.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So, well, I think we've covered all the questions. I think. Let's see. Oh, that's okay. Helen is just saying that the Solanaceae family members are pollinated by bumblebees, and folks, you can look up on chat what she's saying. There's a deep look video produced by KQED on buzz pollination.
Yes, so some flowers are produced. So there's a vibration that bumblebees make, and so that will cause the pollen to be released.
Right.
So
You have to hit I think they have to hit a C or something.
something, yeah.
A high C?
Yes.
Or not a high C, but a C.
Yes, some of those.
And they buzz, and then all of a sudden, yeah. Oh, wow. Yes. Okay. Well, I think I'm just going to check one last time, but I believe you've answered all the questions.
Great.
So, thank you so much for being with us and for a fantastic program.
Thank you.
I don't think we'll look at flowers the same way ever again.
Wonderful. I hope everyone's got a new appreciation for flowers.
And we'll have to have you back for cycads.
Definitely.
Your specialty.
Yes. Yeah. And I think ferns, people would love to hear about ferns.
Yes. And we have ferns growing in Pacifica. People plant them. They're not native here, but here and there, I see cycads. And I'm going, oh, that's one. Oh, that's one. So, it's something to look forward to.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you all for joining me and for your great questions.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.